Hi, so today we're joined with Margaret Killjoy. How are you, Margaret?
I'm okay.
We'll be talking about the Substack that you wrote during the elections, right after, I guess, the results obviously came out, called "The Sky is Falling, We've Got This," or "Yes, it's bad, no, we need not despair." And
hmm
it's a piece I told you at the time that like I sent to a bunch of friends, especially those in the US and especially those in the US who are trans, who were very understandably freaking out. Some of them
Yeah.
still are also understandably freaking out. And it helped them. And long story short, it felt like instinctively like a good idea to also do an episode on this because I think it would help them. So I have them in mind basically with this episode, but obviously we'll talk about like broader themes and whatnot. But
Yeah.
what has your what the past 10 days for you? How has they been?
You know, I'm not freaking out, but that's not because I'm like inherently smarter or something like that. It's more, I find that going into trying to get stuff done mode is one of the best ways to avoid panic.
Yeah.
And so I've just been going in with like a lot of anarchists and activists in the US. We've just sort of been putting our head down and being like, all right, how do we get stuff done? How do we just start? I mean, not start, we've been starting for a long time, but the clock is ticking. We have this certain amount of time until Trump's second presidency that we have every reason to believe will be worse than his first one
Yeah,
especially for migrants and trans people and
hmm
but also for everyone.
hmm
But yeah, I guess I've been, or maybe it's funny because it's not that I've been avoiding thinking about it, but I kind of wonder why I'm not more worried. And the best guess I have is that I'm like, well, I'm just trying to be productive. I don't know.
I mean, you mentioned that therapist friend of yours in that piece as well. Now,
Yeah.
let me read what's like. A therapist friend of mine, this is from the piece, reiterates to me all the time that acting with agency is the primary way to avoid being traumatized by negative experiences. End quote. As it happens, like I was just listening just today to I think it's the last episode of the podcast On the Nose by Jewish Currents.
Okay.
And they had Naomi Klein, the editor-in-chief, Ariel Angel, as well as Hala Alian, who's this Palestinian novelist, poet, and she's also a therapist.
hmm
And she mentions, she's one of those who introduced me. I don't think she's the one who coined it or who talked about it first, but she's the one who at least introduced me. Like I first heard about this through her work. That like even the concept of PTSD in the context of like Gaza doesn't make much sense because there's no P. Like it's
Yeah,
never been a
totally.
moment where
Yeah.
it's been like a continuous moment, like series of traumatizing events. So like when does it, when do we start healing basically?
Yeah.
And it's important. The reason she brought that up as well, the title of that episode is called Volatile Emotions, is this notion that in most, activist spaces, the left, anarchists, etc., affect is usually under discussed, like in terms of the role of emotions, like sitting with
hmm
them, dealing with them. When are they, I don't know if valid is the right term because I guess they're always valid, but like when are they to be trusted? When are they to be challenged? Because we all react in certain ways that are not necessarily the way we would always react or the way we may, maybe I react in the moment in a way that I wouldn't react like half an hour later or whatever. And all of this is rendered more complicated with social media because everything is like permanently inked on the internet or whatever. And yes, I bring this up because like today, I mean, we're recording this on November 17th, and this day has been very weird in good and bad ways. And it's kind of nice that we're recording this. For me, it's the evening. It's 8:20 p.m. or so. Because today is, in Lebanon was maybe one of the worst days in the past few months in terms of bombardments by the Israelis. And it's expanded the reach in terms of where they bomb. So like more and more people that
Yeah.
I know also because there's been a bit of this almost, normalization or like, it's never become normal, but we almost know where they're going to target because it's a bit regular or it's a bit
Uh-huh.
like, yeah, I guess that's the term. I'm not entirely sure. Predictable, I guess, or more or less predictable. But today wasn't as much. Like they've expanded where they've been bombing basically. And
Okay.
so
Yeah, I was looking at a video of that right before I signed on
yeah,
of
yeah.
an apartment building being destroyed. Yeah.
Yeah, there's been actually, I think like, I actually don't know how many today, like I think five, maybe different buildings entirely collapsed, like leveled.
Yeah.
One of them next to like a friend of mine's sister's apartment.
Fuck.
She's okay, thankfully, but But today, so this was obviously and still is in my mind. And just like half an hour ago, there was another, I think it was a drone strike on some car or something next to another friend's cousin's apartment. So it's I mean, Lebanon's small, and Beirut even smaller. But today is also World Prematurity Day. And for me, it's a big deal because my kid was born extremely premature.
Oh, okay.
And it's like a hopeful thing. The day is like, for me, and at the very least, it's like, well, we went through this nightmare for the past first months of her life, and now she's doing insanely good.
Yeah.
And it's at the same time, like those two things are on my mind at the same time,
Yeah.
right? Like, and it's difficult to not acknowledge one without also acknowledging the other, but in a way that for me isn't like, it doesn't downplay the horror of one. But at the same time, I'm trying to push back against downplaying the good of the other, if that makes sense. Like, it's not like the positive should also be acknowledged, if that makes sense, but not in a way that the negative gets downplayed.
Yeah, like you don't want to look at the silver lining of them bombing,
Yes.
but you want to look at the things in your life that are positive and bring you hope or like make you happy you're alive or whatever.
Yeah. And initially it was like survivor's guilt. And I mean, I still have it. It's not gone. And it was also
That
like, why
makes
should
sense.
Yes. And why should I enjoy this? Because, this person can't, or my friends back home, my cousin or what have you. And last time I had you on, I mentioned like for a long time, I wasn't even able to go hiking
Yeah.
because and still am in many ways, like so worried about global warming that I didn't want to get attached in some sense to
Yeah.
nature,
Yeah.
even though I always was, but like, yeah, it's like almost protecting myself, preemptively or whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah. I bring this up just because like the thesis of your piece or whatever, like one of the main arguments is that maintaining this, whatever we want to call it, some folks will call it optimism, hope, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Not just a matter of like, oh, look on the bright side kind of thing, because that can get a bit cartoonish, like Monty Python-y pretty quickly sometimes. But also like you need to do that in order to tackle things that are not so good. Like you literally need it. Like your brain cannot function otherwise.
Yeah. Yeah. We need to have a reason to do a thing or we won't do the thing. And we need to trick ourselves. There's I can't remember if we talked about it last time or not, but there's the whole hope is a discipline concept, right? Yeah. Which I think originally comes from this Catholic nun, and which makes sense because I think in Catholicism, despair is a sin. Yeah. And so like, we were going to build frameworks around preventing that. But yeah, no, it's just like, well, that's what I need. I need in the morning to be like, well, I need to continue to try and get stuff done. That's the only way. The only way we can get stuff done is to believe that it's possible. And it becomes possible when we, everything that is happening right now is being done by people, and we're people too.
Exactly. Yeah. There's this excellent line. I reposted it after the election results as well, and went mini viral or whatever on Blue Sky because I think it resonated, which is like, it's one of James Baldwin's many excellent quotes. He was just good at quotes.
And he was.
he mentioned this thing like I am forced to be an optimist is how he put it.
Yeah.
Because to be a pessimist is to accept or something that life is an academic matter is how he put it.
Yeah.
It's something that like, you're detached from, like you can just study as if it's, you're studying, I don't know, Tudor England of Edo Japan or whatever, like something that's just in the past.
Yeah.
Almost like as if you're disconnected from it. And of course, there are different ways of studying history in ways that that's not the case. But I mean, you can do that. Some folks do that. And for him, it's more, he also said it in a different way. And this is what I resonate with a lot. Like my kid is 13 months old and he wrote to his nephew a lot. One of his books is on that. Mm-hmm. And it's like, how can you look at that kid and tell them like, give up, tell them like this, it's worth it. It's not worth it. Because most of us don't do that. That's the interesting thing. We don't actually, we try and protect their innocence or whatever. But what does that mean? Like you're doing that in a way that you have to believe somehow that it's worth it. So you see what I mean?
No. And I think I think that the whole idea is that because I think that a lot of people are sort of allergic to hope, or my friend calls it hopium,
Yeah.
This idea that like everything's fine, or like, every now and then you'll see the article that's like 3 positive things with climate change this year. And it's like, and there's little tiny things where it's like, oh, we got a battery that's slightly better, or like we saved this park, or, or like major, huge things like the dams that were removed in the Pacific Northwest after.
Yeah.
generations of different tribes working to get them removed, right? And but it's at the same time, it's like, well, we need to look. You can you not only need hope to get anything done, you have to soberly look at what's happening to get anything done,
Yeah.
right? And so we have to say it's bad, and that's the part that people get mixed up. You have to do both. You have to say it's bad. Here's some ideas that we can try and develop about how to do something about it. We have to
Mhm.
actually look at the situation. We can't fight an imaginary war. We have to fight the actual war that's in front of us, you know?
Yeah, yeah. It's weird. Like, so I always bring things back to Lebanon, but
That
we
makes
have
sense because it's a bad things are happening right there, you know?
yeah. And we're like, there's a lot of warlords in Lebanon, or they don't call themselves that. Obviously, I call them that, but they were warlords during the war, during the civil war, and they still in power. So I call them that. And some of them are very old. Like some of them, one of them is 86, another one is 88. And yet it kind of feels, in the way I talk, we reflect about on this with my friends a lot, because of course Hassan Nasrallah was killed a few months ago, and he was one of those political figures who it was even conceptually impossible to imagine that he will not always be around. Like it
Yeah,
was
okay.
like, even that, because it was this overwhelming presence. Like he's everywhere. He's like one of the de facto kingmakers, was whatever. And today I'm speaking the same way about those other important politicians, like influential politicians in Lebanon.
Yeah.
But the rational part of me obviously knows that that's not true. Like one is, he's 88, he's 86. Like he doesn't have, and he doesn't look good. Like he doesn't have that many years left in front of him. And yet it almost feels like thinking about it or talking about it. And this is, again, it's like between friends of mine.
Mhm.
Feel like what's the point? Because we don't know when and what can we do about it in one time. But at the same time, this other part of me feels like it's very important to think like that, because part of their power is this projected invincibility. It's almost like you have to, it's
Yeah.
almost like you're watching a movie in many ways, and you have to believe the thing that you have a suspension of disbelief. And you have to almost forget that they are also mortal. They bleed like you, and
Yeah.
they make decisions. Many of them are very stupid decisions, and some of those decisions hurt them, obviously. And what I'm saying is that it's not like because I've had this conversation again after the election. I was like, I know, yeah. So I wasn't trying to dismiss or anything, but like, yeah, it is going to be bad, and there's no reason to believe otherwise. And as you said, like the administration is objectively much worse, and even the people you just appointed are like worse than even the last time around.
Yeah.
In many ways. And every time this happens, it's a worse time because of global warming.
Yeah.
At the same time, how many fascists have said that they're going to have like 1,000-year Reich or whatever the equivalent is, and they were just factually wrong about that?
Yeah.
And it's important to remember that they were wrong. Like, it's important to remember that, like, Hitler got it wrong. Like
Yeah,
he
totally.
was kind of mistaken about it all. He thought he would live longer than he clearly did. And Mussolini is
Yeah.
the same, obviously. And not to always make the Hitler comparison, because I know it's one of the cliches
Yeah,
online, but
but it's pretty accurate, you know?
yeah, I
I
think so.
mean, like it's overdone, but that doesn't mean it's never true, you know?
Yeah. That makes sense. So yeah, sorry, I lost my train. But yeah,
No.
I
Oh,
bring this up.
sorry.
No, because it's important to take those men, usually the men, or like people in general, and not just them, but like the states, the infrastructures around them, take them very seriously, because you have to, and because you need to deal with the realities that
Yeah.
the reality of their presence and power, and the impacts that they're going to have, if not on you, maybe on your loved one, maybe on just your neighborhood, your community, your country, whatever, your world, whatever. And at the same time, and I'm not saying it's easy. It's a very difficult thing to do, and I struggle with it. Remember that they are also mortal, if that makes sense.
No, I think that makes a lot of sense. You know, there's like a meme that goes around for trans people where it's just literally like, you need to stay alive because things are going to change, right? Like I don't know how to, I can't quote the meme accurately right now,
Yeah.
but because it was clearly more clever than that, or it wouldn't have been a meme. But, you know, things will change, and you have to be alive to see things change. And yeah, like most of us are younger than Trump, right? Like most of us statistically are going to outlive that man.
Yeah.
You know? And we should try to. And if we don't, it's not like a failure, right? You know, there's no we just try. That's all
Yeah.
we can do. And I mean it's interesting too, right? Because it's got to be such a strange position for you to watch both Lebanon and the United States, right?
Yes, it is.
Because clearly it is worse to be in Lebanon than the United States right now. You know, as much as I want to be like, hey, it's real bad, right? And it is bad. It's been a while since a government has blown up apartment buildings in the United States while people are in it.
Yeah.
Right? It's happened. It happened in Philly, the Move 9. But it is clearly a worse time to be in Lebanon. And then the thing that's like interesting and messy about it is that there's more knock-on effects for the world. The fact that something bad is happening in the United States.
Yes.
You know, just because we're the center of the most powerful empire in the globe or whatever. But that doesn't make the suffering of the American people like more important. So it's got to be like really weird to watch. Oh, yeah. It's got to be so weird.
It is. So I posted this just once, like what was it? If I'm allowed one very unhelpful take, which is that like, it's exhausting to have to give a shit about the Americans. It's just tiring to do so. And I mean, I would anyway, because of like internationalism and principles and shit.
Yeah, we're like people. Yeah.
People are people or whatever, but like it's tiring because of the consequences and all of that. And because I don't, most people don't get to vote in that election that impacts everyone in the world, basically, or most people in the world or whatever, or a lot of people, whatever. So it is. At the same time, it's because Lebanon has a huge diaspora. There are also lots of Lebanese in the US, including first generation and second or whatever. And so it's more familiar what's happening in the US than if it was in, I don't know, parts of Latin America where there isn't a huge Lebanese diaspora, at least for me personally, I mean.
Right.
So it's in that sense, it's more familiar. At the same time, like I'm based in the UK, and what happens in the US just influences the UK in many ways. And knowing what happens there is also good for me to know, like just personally in terms of survival and also in terms of like feeling that I can do something, because I cope by just digging through something and feeling like I have a grasp of it, even if I don't, but like just feeling I have a better grasp of it, I guess, like just a better understanding of what's happening, because otherwise I think it feels too disarming and it feels too, I would certainly feel much more helpless if I didn't have this obsession with like, I want to figure out like what's up with this thing. Like, why is it happening? If that makes sense.
I really like that attitude. And I think that that's another thing that people struggle with, is they either want to stick their heads in the sand and ignore it because they think that's the way to avoid worrying, or they get so obsessed with it that they worry constantly. And that's also not good. And I agree with you. I think that soberly looking at what's happening so that we can formulate a response is almost always the best thing to do for our own mental health, as well as any strategy that we might have.
Yeah. There's this quote by our good friend Milton Friedman. That's a joke. I don't know if people understand my joke, but like he was not a good person.
I don't know everyone, but I know enough to know that one's a joke.
Yeah. Okay, good. But it's this quote that's been also, I think I read it in like one of Naomi Klein's books, but it's like crisis and there's an opportunity quote. It's one of those things. It's one of those maybe overdone quotes, but specifically in his context, I mean, it's important because he is one of the founders of neoliberal ideology, and his influence cannot be understated, basically. But he wrote like, crisis is an opportunity. Only a crisis, I'm quoting, actual or perceived, produces real change. When that crisis occurs, the actions that are taken depends on the ideas that are lying around, end quote, is how he put it. And he wrote this in the 70s. He's absolutely right. I hate that he is, but he is. And we see this time and time again of like, even like something like conspiracy thinking. In the case of the US, I'm not into it, obviously, but I've researched a lot, conspiracy thinking and theories of the far right, including like QAnon stuff and shit like that. And the fact that it was initially an extremely fringe thing that was really ridiculous, and I mean, still is, and ludicrous and doesn't make much sense, didn't stop it from growing because it clearly gave something to people. And I'm not saying that something is good. It's clearly not, but it filled something. And for me, that's something that I'm trying to identify. And it demystifies it a bit more, if that makes sense. Just like earlier, I was speaking to a Ukrainian friend of mine, and she was asking me about let me see. Yeah, she was asking me about this person that she knows. I don't want to put any details here. who was talking to her in a way that she felt was off. So she was talking to her about Lebanon, and this Ukrainian friend of mine knows a bit, but doesn't know a lot. But she kind of felt from the tone that there was something is off. So she asked me about it, and I contextualized things. I explained things in a certain way, like, oh, what's that person's? I was asking her, like, what's that person's background? Where they come from? You know, how might they be thinking? Because she was very confused about how would someone who is from Lebanon not like be entirely anti-Israel, because they exist. There are people on the right and on the far right in Lebanon as well, and often in the diaspora more than in Lebanon, but they exist, who are like so anti-Hezbollah that they're basically happy with anything that might weaken Hezbollah. And they kind of have that binary, effectively.
Especially if you like your family was targeted by Hezbollah, you're just like, fuck it, I hate that.
Yeah, that exists. And so you have and there are shades of this. It's not important here, but not everyone is that gung-ho, but they exist. The point is that they exist. But I contextualized it a bit, and it made sense to her, the way I explained it, that she felt a bit more comfortable than challenging that friend of hers. Because effectively in that moment, she did not want to speak about Lebanon to a Lebanese. And because, you know, she has her own context or whatever, but just knowing a tiny bit, it's not even that much, but just a tiny bit more, I was able to point her in certain directions to what to read and stuff like that, allowed her to feel a bit less disheartened by that friend of hers. That kind of reminds me a bit of like the stories of people who kind of went down rabbit holes of QAnon or whatever and kind of cut ties with their own families and became very extreme and shit like that. Because we know even in those contexts that usually what brings someone back from like a cult or something like this is that they have still some kind of connection to family or loved ones or friends or whatnot, even if that connection is not exactly at its best, right? Like, but it still exists. They are tethered, is that the word? A bit more, or they still are in a way that maybe they wouldn't have if everyone cut them off completely. And I'm not saying this isn't prescriptive. I'm not saying people should or shouldn't do this. I'm saying that this seems to be the case often. So a lot of thoughts, as you can see, but yeah.
I want to go a half step back when you're talking about our man Milton Friedman, where this idea that during crisis, it's the ideas that are lying around have a better chance. You know, I can't remember exactly how he framed it, but
something like that, yeah.
And I think about this all the time. I think about this all the time when I think about. I remember once I went to this writers conference, and there's like a bunch of us sitting around, and the people who are in charge of the conference weren't there. And so there's like 18 of us, and we're just sitting around, and no one knows like what to do. And so kind of the first pitch of, hey, here's what we can do, therefore sets the tone. And I was like, hey, here's some ideas about how we can, you know, horizontally organize ourselves in the following ways. I wasn't like, here's anarchy, everyone, right? But, you know, it was like, but that set the tone, because the first person to come in and be like, I have a structure, I have an idea, that is so meaningful. And that is like what is present in crisis and what allows things to change so dramatically and quickly. And the things that I think about, so it makes building and learning ideas really useful. I want to compare, and I might be slightly wrong about this, but I want to compare how I think that democratic confederalism in the Kurdish regions, right? You have like the PKK, who've been doing it forever, and they, you know, they're like, that's their thing, and they've been doing it in Turkey, and they're like ideologically committed to this thing, right? But it doesn't take off past their own borders and their own areas. And then there's a crisis in Syria, and now all of a sudden, when someone comes in and says, hey, we have an idea about how to do this, then it can explode into this area and actually create the thing that they've always wanted to create, right? And then the other comparison, if you think about the like 3 great anarchy projects with millions of people in history of Ukraine, Spain, and then Manchuria, the Association, right? Spain is like, you've got like 5th generation anarchists probably at that point, right? And they have like all of this infrastructure, and they're just like waiting for their time, and then crisis comes and they take their time, right? But in Ukraine, you've only got about 12 years of organizing as anarchists in any kind of public way. And so it's this much more well, some people who had been anarchists had an idea, and everyone needed an idea, and here's an idea. And then in Manchuria, you're talking like 2 years of anarchism. You're talking, I think, this one's actually the hardest to get any information about in English, and even in Korean, it's kind of spotty. But overall, you end up with millions of people living, probably, again, the literature is really blurry about this one. You have millions of people living in horizontal society because someone was like, hey, I have an idea about what to do, because we're all in this crisis together. And so the right wing absolutely takes advantage of this. And I know that I'm kind of going off in a different direction, but I think about this process a lot. And, you know, and it's, it gets back to what you're talking about like silver linings, right? Like I'm not like, hey, hooray, Trump won, now that the United States might collapse. Because there's like a non-zero chance he's going to destroy the United States, right? Which will have knock-on effects for the entire world that are impossible to know whether they're good or bad or not.
Yeah.
You know, so I'm not trying to be like, hooray, here's the silver lining, but instead it's more like being poised to take advantage of a situation that might occur. You know, even if it's not the situation that we would choose to put ourselves in. I don't know whether that makes sense.
It does. And like, because the people like Trump and co right now are putting things in motion in a way that they don't have full control over. There's this excellent, so there's this word in Arabic called tanfis, which just means like letting air out, like, you know, deflating a balloon or whatever. And it's a concept that was, I don't know where it was, in which context it was initially coined, but I know it in the context of Syria a lot. Well, I know that in the rest of the Arab world, like the dictatorships, in any case, it's been used like that, because the idea is that from time to time, the dictatorships, especially like in Syria, like Hafez al-Assad and al-Bashar al-Assad, this was before 2011, would allow certain very small scale protests, usually when it comes to Palestine, because it kind of looked good when it was still a pan-Arabism was still kind of a big thing or whatever. In a way of almost like saying, you know, we're still democratic, we listen to the people or whatever. But what's sort of interesting is that sometimes it got out of hand, in the sense that they would, by allowing protests, even if they are very small, controlled, symbolic, whatever, even like telling them which chants to use, they're also letting people, even if it's a short amount of time, discover something that they didn't have any experience of in the past.
Yeah.
And we know this in the context of the Gulf. Dana Al-Kurd, who's one of my co-hosts, she's Palestinian. She wrote this in context of Qatar, where the Qatari government would allow also like protests in the name of Palestine and whatnot. But this would have a bit of a knock-on effect, because how can you be in a kind of an absolute monarchy as a Qatari citizen? I mean, because Qatar is mostly non-citizen, migrant, domestic, and other laborers. Okay. Most of the Gulf is. But how can you do that and still talk about like justice for Palestinians, you know, two-state solution, one-state solution? You're starting to think politically. But in the context of Qatar, you're not supposed to. You know, you have an absolute monarchy, and that's it. It will give you some stuff, some welfare state, and basically shut up about it. And that has this knock-on effect. And so Tanfiz is like, it's letting off steam, as the leaders, let's say, would put it, or whatever. Like we'll let them play with their cause or whatever, as long as they don't threaten us in any kind of fundamental way, of course. But in this inadvertently, I mean, one can make that argument that Hafez al-Assad in the 90s being slightly, and I emphasize because he was a monster, slightly more tolerant to certain civil disobediences, and Bashar as well after he took over in 2000 and in the first few years, led in many ways, or at least contributed to people having this possibility in mind, thinking like, well, now 2011 came along, the Arab Spring. Well, I remember that in 2005 or 2002, my uncle or my cousin or my sister or, you know, elder sister, whatever, took part in this demonstration. And so she has, or they have something to tell us about that. This thing that I, as someone who's 18 or 16 or whatever, I've never been in a protest before. I've never seen it. I don't know what it looks like. Even movies were heavily censored before 2011. So I don't, maybe that I can imagine it, but like just as in the same way I can imagine Middle Earth, like it's a fantastical thing. But I have this concrete connection, and this concrete connection in some ways was a misstep by those dictatorships. Like it did not benefit them in the long term.
Yeah.
And That's what I mean when I say like recognizing that those people in power are just people who have power
Yeah.
allows me, at least from time to time, and it's a coping mechanism in many ways, to recognize that like, well, they've made mistakes and they've lost things that they clearly had no like they didn't plan for.
Yeah.
They assumed that like the Syrian regime assumed would have Lebanon until beyond 2005. 2005 there was a big uprising and it forced the Syrian army out of Lebanon, and they didn't plan that. They didn't want that. They assumed it might stay forever, as far as they're concerned.
Yeah.
And they were just wrong. They were just wrong, factually wrong. So what does that do to their own self-mythologizing, right? And so those are the things I kind of keep in mind because, and I last week, I'll end on this point, that I went to Dublin and I took part in this debate. Not a huge fan of this format, but I went there out of curiosity. And it was on like, do you support the two-state solution or the one-state solution in Israel-Palestine? And I was like, neither really, but I have to choose one of the two. One-state solution feels better than a two-state solution. And the pros and the cons, and it was a bit performative. I'm not a huge fan of the format, but one of the two-state solution people at some point mentioned the word realistic. And I didn't have time, like what is more realistic, basically. And I didn't have time in the moment to express just how much this concept sometimes bothers me. Because I think it's used in a way that's like almost masks the fact that it's also a belief. That realism, as in ism, I mean, is also a belief, because if you're saying, well, I think this is more realistic than this, sometimes you may have all of the facts on your side and, you might have a very coherent argument and say, well, this X is more realistic than Y in terms of more probable to happen in the short term. That might be the case. But often, at least in my experience, you're making a lot of assumptions that you take for granted in order to make that claim. To say like, I don't think this is realistic because I don't think it's possible for X, Y, and Z to happen because of other factors. And then you get to a point where at some point you're basically making an educated guess. But an educated guess is not the same as being realistic. And yet that's sort of what we have a lot of the time. That's why you have like capitalist realism as a concept and shit like that. And it's that whole like Ursula Le Guin's, what is it? We live in capitalism.
Yeah.
We live in capitalism. Its power seems inescapable, but so did the divine rights of kings.
Okay, but I hate to go back to our man Milton Friedman.
Yes,
in a way that I didn't expect to. When people talk about things being realistic, it's like, okay, imagine someone who's has a chain around their ankle and it is pinned to the ground, and they want to walk a mile, right? And so, but they can walk. They can walk a good quarter mile, right? But then the chain will catch up to them and then they can't move anymore. And so it feels more realistic to walk rather than fight the guard who is keeping the chain there, right? Yeah. But if you need to go a mile, it's actually more realistic to fight the guard instead of walk the quarter mile, and then you can't anymore. And the status quo needs to no longer be the status quo for the level of change that is necessary for, at least, like, I think mostly about climate change personally. Obviously I think about fascism and genocide and war and stuff, but partly as relates to climate change. Yeah. And it's like, we need to fix climate change or we're literally all doomed, right? And it seems so much more realistic, even though revolution has like a shitty track record and like is like complicated and messy and usually goes wrong. It still feels more realistic than thinking that the existing democratic systems of the United States will allow for the changes necessary for the world's most powerful empire to make the changes necessary to start addressing climate change. And it and you can see it even in like weird polling in the United States, like burning down the police precinct in Minneapolis was more popular than either of the presidents that just ran.
Yes. Yeah.
We need to, the status quo is not more realistic. And I think that what you're saying about like Palestine, I think the one state solution is more realistic because the two state solution isn't going to happen.
Yes, exactly.
And if it is, it's going to be at best the deal that was offered in the 90s, which was not a two-state solution. It was a nightmare, not even compromise. It was like a subjugation request, And so it's just like the two-state solution. You can't have a solution while Israel exists.
Mhm.
Like, I don't know how else to say it, but that, like, you could have a one state secular, Jews are welcome, everyone gets a vote, like, don't have to kick anyone out
Mhm.
solution. That feels possible. But like, while Israel's in power, they are clearly not going to allow Palestine to exist at any fundamental level.
Yeah.
Sorry, that was kind of a rant.
No, it's important because again, it's like, but even in that debate I mentioned, I almost felt that I got a bit of a concession that like the two-state solution is unrealistic, because
Yeah.
but that was their argument that it is the realistic one, and it's like, then what are we doing here? Because like
Yeah, totally.
at
Totally.
some point it's like, well, if it's completely like, this is what needs to happen for the thing that you're calling two-state. I'm just using it as an example. It's not that important.
Yeah.
A two-state solution. This is what needs to happen. Gaza needs to be left alone by the Israelis. The West Bank needs to be left alone by the Israelis. The Israelis need to allow or accept a bridge between Gaza and the West Bank.
It's controlled by Palestinians instead of
That's
the
controlled by
Israelis.
Palestinians, and also accept that East Jerusalem, which they've already annexed, goes back to the Palestinians.
Yeah.
And you have to accept that they are not just willing, but that they can be pressured to do this. Like, even if tonight the entire world decides this is what needs to happen, and you have like 10 months to do it or whatever, because that was the UN vote like a month or not 2 or 3 months ago. They said, okay, the occupation is illegal. I mean, it's been illegal international law-wise since it began in 1967, and you have 1 year or whatever to dismantle the settlements and shit like that. But that's like 700,000 people. So like, even if they had agreed to do it now, it's not going to take them a year. So like, even the law doesn't even take into consideration whether something seems to be realistic or not.
Yeah.
And it's a bit of this absurd situation we're in. But anyway, it's not important here. But like, it's one of the many ways for me that sometimes I feel like I'm losing my mind. It's like even the people that seem to be arguing for something don't seem to believe it. Like, in terms of like one two-state solution, but it's like
you're right,
they go through the
just wanna
motion
say
or
they
whatever.
tried.
Yeah. They go through the motion or whatever, and they say like, well, clearly this is what everyone else is saying needs to happen, so I'm saying it needs to happen. And hey, I'm gonna recognize the state of Palestine, which barely exists, and I'm gonna continue relations with Israel anyway, and hope for the best. That's basically what policies are now, for the most part.
No, and I think that this is a broadly applicable thing. I remember talking with someone I love very dearly about the need to change things for the climate, right? Yeah. And I was like, at the very least, a Green New Deal or whatever. You know, this is like the least of my things that I would ever consider, right? You know, and this person is like, yeah, but it'll never go through, right? And I'm like, well, if the system won't allow the Green New Deal to go through, then we should not accept the system's existence.
Mm-hmm.
Like, if the solution that could go through the system can't go through the system, then the system can't fix the problem. And I think that there's this tendency, and I think it's particularly a liberal tendency, to have your goal be like, well, at least I tried.
Yes.
You know? And like, and not even in at least I tried from a direct action point of view, where you're at least like putting some skin in the game and like actually trying, you know? Instead, you're like, well, at least I voiced my concern. And you're like, well, look, that's fine. I'm not doing a ton more than voicing my concern, but I'm at least trying to formulate strategies that could possibly work.
Yeah. Like like I said, I don't like this thing. So what do you want from me? I said I don't like it. So, but I do see that attitude a lot. And, you know, like, so one of the things in your own piece is, it's like, I think in the beginning, like, things can always get worse, which also means that things can always get better. And that's the thing about the future. I did an entire fucking PhD on ontologies and temporalities and like the time the past and how the past affects the present. And I swear, Margaret, after 7 years of doing this, and especially in the context of post-war Lebanon, I specifically looked into how the past affects the present and how that manifests itself in movies. That's kind of the overall thing.
Okay.
And the thing is that like the people who were doing it at the time, so like the movies that were produced at a specific point in time, were not talking to me. You know, they were talking to them. They were talking to themselves. They were to their audiences at the time. Like, it's a movie released in 1982 isn't talking to me in 2024 or whatever. It's talking to an audience in 1982.
Right.
And what's interesting is when there seems to be a resonance, like when it feels that I am also the audience, even if it's like not their intention whatsoever, because how can it be? I didn't even exist. So how can that be? And what's interesting about that is that it kind of collapses a bit time, if that makes sense. And it makes things like studying history feels more concrete to me because here I am watching this movie, and usually it's a documentary in the case of Lebanon, or something that's meant to be realistic, like it's based on a true story or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And they're talking about their hopes and dreams and what the things they're going through and what the recent past has been for them, how they understand it. And more importantly, they have a vision of the future. And it's that thing that like, you probably know this, but like the vision of the future in like American movie series, TV productions, whatever, in the 50s, 60s ish, more or less, was kind of more optimistic than the futurisms usually that we have today. And that was like before cyberpunk, obviously.
Yeah.
I think a lot about the Jetsons because it's like roughly, it's like, what was it? I think as of last year, 60 years had passed since, what was it? Something like that. Like we were in the midpoint between when it was released and when it's set, something like that. Like it's set in 2050, let's say, or whatever, 2060. And what was interesting about that series, that, you know, I have all of this high tech shit, a robot, whatever, stuff like that. But you still had very like 1950s white American gender norms.
Yeah.
You know? And so like, that's interesting for me because like those people imagined a future, but couldn't imagine beyond what we, or many of us today, consider like very rigid, you know, gender binary norms, all of that shit.
Yeah.
And that's why I love Star Trek. And that's why I like these things where like they are trying to imagine the future. And I like to pick that apart, basically, like, you know, which bits of it feels quote unquote realistic, which of it doesn't, you know, and stuff like that. And it helps me take the present very seriously, but also not take it as the only way things can ever be, if that makes sense, because it's factually incorrect to believe that.
Yeah, because you can look back at what people thought that the future was going to be in the 50s and are like, well, we didn't build flying cars, but we sure broke gender.
Yes. Yes.
You know?
Yeah.
No, that's interesting. And it is such a good point about, the things that, you know, people, and I don't know if you knew this, but white people in America don't say the best things about the Middle East.
Oh, no, I didn't know this.
On a region. Yeah, no, it's, you know, there's this absolute fatalism from anywhere on the center and probably everywhere else too. But this like, oh, well, those people are always fighting each other.
Yes.
You know, as if this is like this like intrinsic characteristic in its horrible racialized eugenicist way,
yes.
You know, and it's just like so interesting because it's like, well, first of all, everyone's always fighting each other. That's just like you can kind of say that about humanity. You could say that humanity tends to fight itself, right?
Yes, yes.
But like, well, the Israeli-Palestine conflict is as old as Israel.
Yes.
You know? Which is like,
it's younger than my grandmother.
Who are older than that.
Yeah, it's younger than my grandmother.
Yeah. Like, and so it's just like, well, that's just not true. Like, you know, and there's things that Americans care deeply about that they consider like yesterday, like the Civil War, that are twice as old, you know?
Yeah.
And the things that are don't have to be the way that things end up. And like, I feel like there's a lot of, you know, I told this to myself for a while, and I tell it to a lot of my friends who are going through certain types of hard times, where sometimes your only job is to kind of like keep your head down and stay alive.
Yes.
Because things are going to be different. And maybe your skill set, or maybe like what you have to offer about changing the world, or maybe the way you wish the world was, isn't what's happening right now.
Mm-hmm.
But like, just try not to die for 10 years. And it's going to be different. And you can look again, you know, and I don't want to like, not in like a hibernation way.
Yeah,
right?
no, I know what you mean. Yeah.
You know, and I used to think about it when I think about like how books would fast forward. I'd read these like novels, you know, these grand epic fantasy novels or something, right? And you kind of fast forward, and then suddenly it's 5-10 years later and the characters are all older, and And then they get back at it, right? And like, what were you doing for the past 10 years? And you're like, well, I was happily married, or I was miserable and drinking, or some combination of the two.
It's a bit of that. I don't know if you know that memes that like in Lord of the Rings, Gandalf says like, "Wait for me" to Frodo, and he fucks off for like 15 years or something.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, sorry.
And to Gandalf is not a big deal, you know?
Yeah.
And so that's just like what happens sometimes. And obviously a lot of things can't wait. And any activism that we can do that could possibly impact things is going to have an impact, you know? I mean, I almost feel bad saying this, right? Because one of the things that I think is very depressing is that most of the activism within the colonial core has not changed things, right?
Yeah.
We obviously ended up with two different presidential candidates arguing about who hated Palestinians more.
Yeah.
You know, and like no one was bothering to mention like, hey, even if we pretend like it's okay for Israel to do this to Palestine, why is it okay for it to do it to Lebanon?
Yeah.
Like, though that's not a conversation that's happening in the mainstream political space. And so it's really easy for people to get disillusioned by activism.
Yeah.
And now, granted, you can look at some of the direct action activism that actually did change at least a little bit of things, at least based on what I read about, like the following company is no longer going to manufacture things that are going to, you know, Israel or whatever, right?
Yes.
But it's like what is the point when you can't stop a thing is one of the things that I think about all the time, and I don't have an answer to, and I feel. But like a friend of mine was like got arrested with Jewish Voices for Peace, and then was like reflecting a year later, being like, well, what the hell did that accomplish? Right? And then the only thing I can say is that I'm like, and it does not stop what's happening in Palestine, but I was able to say like, well, it helped make the argument more clear to more people that anti-Zionism is not the same as anti-Semitism.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
You know, and so there's these like things, but then it's like.
But even like I know this from friends in Gaza who especially those who are a bit younger and acquaintances and whatnot, who generally have never met a Jewish person who is not the IDF.
Yeah.
But just for them to know that such a person exists is not something to underestimate. Now, obviously, many people can just go online and see that like not all Jews act like a fucking IDF member, obviously. And there's a way in which it's almost banal to say this out loud. But I come from a context where many people don't have other experiences other than just their immediate experiences.
Right.
And it does make a huge difference. For me, I feel like I was, I'm a Lebanese Palestinian, and I feel I was inoculated against anti-Semitism from an early age because a lot of the people that I ended up kind of discovering online and like, they end up like Emma Goldman and others also happen to be Jewish, and Hannah Arendt and Primo Levi and others also happen to be Jewish. It's like, it's like, well, clearly, not all or whatever, because like there's this person, I have that person in mind. So clearly it doesn't make sense to have this. And this was before I kind of understood like the role of anti-Semitism and conspiracy thinking and this history of it and whatnot. Before I got into the intellectual side of it, if you want, I was able to almost by happenstance, like inoculate myself slightly, even emotionally, this just feels wrong because I have someone in mind that contradicts this thing that you're saying, right? And I bring this up because like and maybe we can slowly wrap up because I also want you to talk a bit about your novel, which I'm excited to read. The concept of shifting baseline syndrome, for those who don't know, is that effectively the example that's usually given is that if you're a fisherman, whatever, in a certain area, and you're used to, 100 tons of fish every year or whatever, your child then gets used to 70 tons of fish because of overfishing or whatever, and then your grandchild 40 tons of whatever, something like that. And so what that third generation is used to, this is the world, this is reality. Maybe they have some memory because like their grandparents told them, actually back in my day, I used to fish, whatever. But maybe not because too much time has passed. So we don't have conversations unless you have like, you're part of a community that has this strong oral tradition, which most people unfortunately don't anymore, but many people still do. Sure. You don't have this like, this connection of like, well, actually, I know that 200 years ago, this was common. Like I used to know that my grandfather once told me it was not uncommon for him to see something called the Syrian bear. So like a bear that's called Syrian bear.
Okay.
in the mountains of Mount Lebanon and of Palestine. It wasn't uncommon to see one. It wasn't like every day, but it wasn't uncommon. And now, like, I think there was like one mother and its two cubs, and her two cubs like 2 years ago crossed the border from Syria into Lebanon, and it was fucking news in Lebanon. You know, like it's just,
Yeah.
it's so uncommon. It was like, wow, this huge thing happened. That wasn't, you know, two generations ago. And so that's the negative side of shifting baseline syndrome. The positive side of shifting baseline syndrome is that most of us don't have to worry about DTT and the ozone layer, as basically everyone up until like 5 seconds before whenever it was in the 90s.
Yeah.
It's not to say that the problem is gone forever or that things are just amazing, but just that there was something that was done that did kind of fix the main problem at the time that was being, people were really freaking out about for understandable reasons. And we wouldn't be even having this conversation. We've been having most things had this good thing not happened. So like even the good things in terms of shifting baseline syndrome are things that we end up taking for granted, that we don't even know about, that we don't know, you know, if some, like, I don't know, some anarchist killing some kind of dictator or whatever, or some person killing, we may know maybe in the background, but we live in the aftermath of that world, good or bad.
Yeah.
And we take it for granted either way, because that is the world we live in. And so if we reverse engineer this, something that we do today may not, you mentioned your orchard the last time you were around, may not be something that we even live to see the fruits of, but it doesn't mean that there won't be. And that's the difficult bit. Being able to, it's like the 7 generation thing on like 3 generations on either side of you. It's not an easy thing, but it does feel like it's the way to go. At least it's a framework that makes more sense to me.
No, I mean, that makes sense. I think that when we look back, assuming that there's enough people to do books and stuff like 4 generations from now, right?
Yeah.
And we look back at what's happening, most of the world is just going to look like assholes, right? Mm-hmm. Like most of the world is going to be like, well, what the fuck? You all just let that happen? Like, what's wrong with you?
Yeah.
Yeah. But then people will be like, well, the following group broke into the following weapons manufacturer, or, the following people did all of this stuff, or, the following people went there and tried to witness, and it'll probably be the same problem where the people who are not Palestinian will be held up higher, right? Than and maybe not. Actually, that might not be true, because if you look back at even like, if you look at World War II, right, it was like the most talked about genocide in history, at least in America. We talk about, we do actually hold up like the Jews who fought the genocide.
Yes.
A lot more than just specifically the like non-Jewish saviors or whatever. So maybe there's some hope here with that. Yeah.
Okay, so I want you to talk about your book before doing that, have you read a book called Anarchist Modernity by Sho Konishi?
No, it sounds familiar. Why does it sound familiar? Probably.
So it's called Anarchist Modernity: Cooperatism in Japanese Russian Intellectual Relations in Modern Japan. That's the subtitle of it.
Okay.
And so I bring this up because Konishi is this kind of Japanese academic. I think he's in Oxford or something, based there, and he has this quote that was like in an interview that was published 4 years ago by Matt Margosian, who was like a previous guest on this podcast as well. And the quote is like this, I'm quoting him: "If you feel like you are locked in, but you feel no other way to survive in this world, do something outside of your," quote unquote, he says here, "employed time that can be locked in by forces that you feel are outside of your control. There are alternative times that belong to you when you can create and belong to another temporality and yet act in effective ways," end quote. So he mentioned this. The conversation was in the context of that book of his, which was like roughly like the conversations and even direct exchanges between Japanese and Russian anarchists and other anti-authoritarians, roughly like towards the, I think, late 1800s, early 1900s, like a period of like 4 decades or something like that. And what was fascinating about that story, which I highly recommend to listeners, A, it's a very well written book and it's just interesting to read, but B, it's like, the people who were having conversations with one another, like, okay, the role of Russia in terms of whether it's a Western state or not, it's a complicated thing I'm not going to get into right now. At the time, it was more of a thing that was being put into question partly because the Russian Empire was defeated by Japan in that one battle or whatever, which was like a big thing at the time because the first time that like a non-Western power defeated a big one.
Yeah.
And so it's many things are kind of, maybe it goes back to the whole, like when a crisis occurs or whatever. So many things were up for grabs or like up for questioning or something like that. But what I found fascinating is that I was reading that book, Japanese people conversing with Russians. In my mind, I was like, in which fucking language are you doing this? First of all, because like you don't speak the same language. But there were Japanese who spoke Russian, and people learned, and the translation the effort people made to learn other languages fascinates me at the time.
Totally. They might have been using Esperanto.
There were some that were using Esperanto. This was mentioned as well in the book. But there were also just Russians who learned enough Japanese to do so, and Japanese who learned enough Russians to do so. But they were talking to one another without having what we consider today the West in mind. And I find that fascinating, that this was a conversation that I'm part of, from the Peripheries Media Collective, would be like from a periphery to periphery conversation, effectively. Now again,
without going through.
Yes, without going through like a medium, because like even part of the problem we have today is that if I want to converse with someone who's like from Hong Kong or Ukraine or whatever, for the most part, we're going to do so in English.
Right.
And not just the language itself, but the fact that even the references that we may have to between one another is like very likely like something that's like Western.
Right. And a lot of stuff will get translated to English and then back to
exactly.
Yeah,
exactly. So like this has its limitations. It also has potential. I mean, everything does, but it has its limitations. And so I found that fascinating. And so Konishi and the quote that he mentioned is partly with that book in mind. That's the book that he wrote in mind, because he was saying that like it's very difficult, and at the same time it's very important to remember that like when you feel locked in, you're more, by locked in I mean like you're stuck in the mental space you're currently in. Let's put it that way. More often than not, you're objectively wrong that you are locked in the sense that like something can still happen to get you out of that mental state. And you know, I can something as banal as like you need to take a shower, or like you're taking drugs now and you're clearly going to be go for a walk. And we know this like now scientifically as well, like actually it does quite literally change your own brain in many ways. And so therefore, factually, like objectively, this has an impact. And yet in the moment, it can feel like, well, what's the point? There's no point doing something like that.
Yeah.
And that's a difficult thing, of remembering the thing that is worth doing in a moment that feels like it's not worth doing it. Like almost going through the motion, even if you don't believe that you need to go through the motion. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, and that's when I was learning to control my own brain with cognitive behavioral therapy to get out of like a panic disorder. One of the things that we would talk about is that you need to just, like, it's kind of based on fake it till you make it. Like pretend like you're free, right? And the only way to become free is to act like you're free. You know, I mean, obviously, if we all immediately acted entirely on our own will, it would maybe go real badly, right? There's like, you know, like I'm not saying if there's sirens behind you to just ignore it when you're driving. No, that's interesting. I like that.
Just that, like as a hopefully hopeful note to end on my side, because it's one of those things that again, like we take it for granted when we talk about something that's like enough further removed in the past. If that makes sense. Like, you know, if someone tells you, well, yeah, if someone had killed baby Hitler, things would have ended up differently. Like, yeah, I mean, sure. If it seems a logical thing. I mean, I don't think you should kill babies, but that seems a logical thing to conclude. And yet, okay, that didn't happen, and therefore the timeline we're on basically was locked in, or it feels like that, and so on. But many decisions were made that led to this ultimate thing that, if we talk about the Holocaust as the ultimate thing here, to this ultimate crime, this ultimate horror, that those things could have been done differently. And this question of like, what if, is a very difficult one in history, but it's something that I think the best historians do all the time. Trying to, you're imagining it because it never happened, but you're not imagining it in a way that's like unrealistic. You're imagining it because like you literally know what happened and why it happened. And so it's not impossible or again unrealistic to ask yourself, well, what if this other thing that seems to have been as likely to happen, what if that thing happened instead? What could the thing, what would have followed after that, basically? And
Like,
that's
what if the
that's a,
Zionist project had done the cultural Zionism instead of the like geographic Zionism? And like, what if,
yes, yes.
or had even just showed up and been nice, you know?
Yeah,
Like,
yeah. What if like so many because yeah, this is I think
the
we
like the Jewish work thing, you know, like
yeah.
the thing where they only, for anyone who's listening, there's a thing where in early Zionism they in Palestine they would only hire other Jews and they created
Yes.
their own economic sphere and then
Yes. The
started.
kibbutzim and stuff like that.
Yeah, no, I know you know this, or I
Yeah,
just
yeah,
was,
yeah. I'm saying truthfulness.
yeah. Um, and you know, like there's so many what ifs in everything, but maybe what you were getting to is that it's like, well, we forget about the what ifs of what we're doing right now,
Exactly.
right?
That's exactly it. Yeah.
Yeah, we're so worried that, you know, oh, if someone went back in time and changed one that killed a different fly with a time machine, then the entire world would be different. Well, like, well, clearly what we're doing right now is like killing flies.
Yeah. Yeah. The people who don't want us to, who want us to despair, I think can be wrong, and we should not prove them wrong. I don't care what they personally think, but like we should do so regardless and do it despite them, and because
Yeah.
factually we can effectively is okay. That's gonna be my end pitch here.
Yeah.
Talk to us about your novel.
Yeah. I wrote a book called The Sapling Cage. I
Yeah.
actually wrote it in about 2017, and it took me a while to get it published. It just came out in 2024
Wow.
from the Feminist Press. And it's technically a crossover book, which is like YA, but it knows that its audience is also adults. And it doesn't make it more like mature. There's not like more sex in it or something like that as a result, but instead there's just certain rules for YA and the American publishing market that I don't have to follow in terms of like the tone of the way the character's emotional space looks and things like that. And
I see.
it is about it's a fantasy world, it's a secondary world, and it's about a young person who wants to go be a witch, but she's not allowed to be a witch because she's a boy. But her best friend has been promised to the witches and doesn't want to go be a witch. And so our protagonist Laurel dresses up as a girl and goes off and joins the witches and then discovers her own womanhood as well. But it's funny because it's like that's the setup of the book and that's the pitch of the book is like trans witch YA, right? But the actual book, like every book that I care about, it's sort of about power. And in this case, there's this blight that is killing all the trees. And it's a story about people consolidating power at the expense of the natural world and just attempting to centralize power. And yeah, and it's I believe very strongly in the power of myth and story. And I also believe that escapism like actually matters. I actually think that the ability to step outside of ourselves sometimes is a essential way to cope with things. Like we shouldn't just live in, you know, we shouldn't just like disappear into our own heads, right? We should still need to come back to reality. But like, I don't know, sometimes you just need to, when the world's horrible, you need to just read a book for a while, you know?
Yeah, for me Star Trek was that for it still is in many ways that for like I would consume the way I could describe it is like reality would get too much, and I would need to pause it for a bit, and pausing it for a bit and doing something else then allows me to do reality again. If that makes sense, like it's just that's. And I think there's. I mean, I'm guessing here, but I think there's probably like enough science. Like, I have a feeling it's one of those things. There's like enough research that can just prove this by now. Like our brains just can like gets oversaturated or over like stimulated or whatever. Like there is a limit. We can't do this forever. And it's important to not like escaping doesn't mean that you're pausing that part of your brain or whatever. I'm guessing, but like I think it's more that you're allowing different synapses to be created. And that allows things to probably flow better. I don't know. Whatever. I'm mixing my metaphors here, but it feels true. It feels accurate.
No, I agree. I think that it's, you know, and there's I can never remember. I always quote Tolkien and Le Guin, and I always get the two mixed up, which is funny because they're very different, but they're also in weird ways not.
Yeah.
But they both have quotes about escapism being essential, and that people will like talk shit on them for being escapist. And one of them was like, could you imagine telling a soldier in a POW camp, this has to be Tolkien, right? Because he fought in the war.
Yeah.
You know, could you imagine telling a soldier in a POW camp that he like shouldn't escape when he can, you know?
Yeah, exactly. That makes sense. All right. Well, Margaret, thanks for doing this again. I hope listeners
thank you
take
so much.
something out of this, as I think they will. But I did feel it's important, and obviously I will link to both the Substack and as well as the sapling cage, which I recommend. A friend of mine got it and then sent it to this other friend of mine who's traveling to the UK and I'm gonna see him at some point. It's just this. Your book has traveled with one person.
Oh, good. No, I know that it doesn't have great international distribution right now because it's a small press.
I don't even know if I don't know if it might be in the UK already. I don't know, but it just happened. I had a friend who did US UK, and so he's gonna give it to me.
Cool.
But yeah,
Awesome.
anyway, thanks for doing this.
All right. Yeah, thank you.
Take care.